According to the prevailing wisdom in the West, the Ukraine crisis can be blamed almost entirely on Russian aggression. Russian President Vladimir Putin annexed Crimea out of a long-standing desire to resuscitate the Soviet Empire, and he can eventually go after the rest of Ukraine.
The best solution of this issue will be, so our colleagues in Western countries do not lose face, that the current Kiev authorities will themselves refuse to join NATO. In fact, they will implement the idea of neutrality.
So we're concerned that this kind of isolated individual who's kind of become a megalomaniac in terms of his notion of himself being the only historic figure that can rebuild old Russia or recreate the notion of the Soviet sphere. It's a dangerous character.
Is the United States and its European allies sharing most of the responsibility for the crisis? The taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement, the central element of a larger strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and to integrate it into the West. Russian leaders have adamantly opposed NATO enlargement, and in recent years they have made it clear that they would not stand by while their strategically important neighbor turned into a Western bastion.
We can see the difficult international situation and the threats posed by current challenges, such as the erosion of the arms control system and NATO's military activities. And yet, Russia's appeals to build a system based on equal, indivisible security that will reliably defend all countries remain unanswered.
Putin's pushback should come as no surprise. After all, the West has been moving into Russia's backyard and threatening its core strategic interests, a point Putin makes emphatically and repeatedly. The geopolitical crisis there shows that realpolitik remains relevant, and countries that ignore it do so at their own peril. American and European decision-makers blundered in attempting to turn Ukraine into a Western stronghold on Russia's border.
Since Ukraine is committed to a Western path in terms of its economy and its politics and its infrastructure, the last thing, indeed, that the Kremlin would like is a successful, democratic, sovereign, independent Ukraine. It would be a signal to Russians what this means, what is happening in its big neighbour.
The Russians have intensely disliked but tolerated substantial NATO expansion, including the accession of Poland and the Baltic countries. But when NATO announced in 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO, Russia drew a line in the sand. Georgia and Ukraine are not just states in Russia's neighborhood, they are on its doorstep. Indeed, Russia's forceful response in its August 2008 war with Georgia was driven in large part by Moscow's desire to prevent Georgia from joining NATO and integrating into the West.
We're going to be talking about this for the rest of our lives. This is the most important event geopolitically really since the collapse of the Soviet Union, since 1989 when the wall came down. 9/11 was perhaps more important for the United States domestically, but from the global perspective, this is a profound shift in the global order. It's the creation of a new Cold War. It changes so much of the way globalization can and cannot persist going forward. It's a massive, massive impact.
The West's triple package of policies, NATO enlargement, EU expansion, and democracy promotion added fuel to a fire waiting to ignite. Putin's actions should also be easy to comprehend. A huge expanse of fat land that Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, and Nazi Germany all crossed to strike at Russia itself. Ukraine serves as a buffer state of enormous strategic importance to Russia. No Russian leader would tolerate a military alliance that was Moscow's mortal enemy until recently moving into Ukraine. Nor would any Russian leader stand idly while the West helped install a government there that was determined to integrate Ukraine into the West. John Mearsheimer, one of the most prominent international relations scholars, argues in his article titled "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault" that Washington may not like Moscow's position, but it should understand the logic behind it.
This is Geopolitics 101. Great powers are always sensitive to the potential threats near their home territory. After all, the United States does not tolerate distant great powers deploying military forces anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, much less on its borders.
Given that most Western leaders continue to deny that Putin's behavior might be motivated by security concerns, it is unsurprising that they had tried to modify it by doubling down on their existing policies and have punished Russia to deter further aggression. Neither the United States nor its NATO allies are prepared to use force to defend Ukraine. The West is relying instead on economic sanctions to coerce Russia into ending its military intervention in the Eastern European country.
The most severe sanctions, such as cutting Russia off from the global SWIFT payment system or excluding Russian banks from the global financial market, would endanger Russia's energy exports to Europe and also other exports where Russia is a significant supplier, such as industrial materials like nickel, copper, etc.
Even if the West could impose significant costs on Russia, the Russian decision makers is unlikely to back down. When vital interests are at stake, countries are invariably willing to suffer great pain to ensure their security. There is no reason to think Russia, given its history, is an exception.
Well, the Putin's line is always that the West imposes sanctions no matter what he does. So he is not communicating publicly connection between his aggressive action and the imposition of sanctions. He may retaliate by seizing also some assets of foreign companies, by making a stronger economic partnership with China. He will also be looking to diversify his reserves away from dollar and euro into other currencies, including Chinese.
Putin hasn't been twiddling his thumbs for the last 8 years, since Crimea's annexation and the first sanctions. I mean, he's been preparing the country for the possibility of new sanctions. So I don't think these sanctions, or even the ones imposed by the US, are going to stop him in his tracks for the moment. It's going to take something much more than that.